She stood in the doorway of the church basement, clutching a worn canvas bag to her chest, her fingers trembling slightly as she watched the other women file past her. Their perfume lingered in the air, expensive, delicate. Their dresses rustled with that particular sound that only fine fabric makes. And there she was, Margaret Chun, 67 years old, wearing a navy blue dress with a tear along the hem that she tried to pin up with a safety pin that morning. The church choir director, a pleasant woman named Susan, had put up a notice 2 weeks ago. Open auditions for the Christmas concert. All voices welcome. Margaret had seen those words. All voices welcome. And something had stirred in her chest. Something she thought had died 30 years ago when her husband passed, when the bills piled up, when singing seemed like a luxury she could no longer afford. She'd been a singer once, a real singer, back in Hong Kong, before she came to America, before everything changed. She performed in small theaters, nothing grand, but her voice had made people stop and listen. Her mother used to say she had a gift from heaven itself. But that was another lifetime. Another Margaret. This Margaret cleaned houses 6 days a week. This Margaret's hands were rough from bleach and scrubbing. This Margaret hadn't sung anything but hymns in 3 decades. And even though she sang quietly, afraid someone might actually hear her. But 2 weeks ago, sitting in the back pew during Sunday service, watching the choir perform, she'd felt again. That old hunger. That desperate need to let something beautiful out of her soul. And so she'd stayed after, hands shaking, and put her name on the audition sheet. Margaret Chun. 7 o'clock slot. She'd written it in small, apologetic handwriting, as if the paper itself might judge her presumption. Now here she was, and the other women glanced at her as they passed. Not unkindly, exactly, just noticing. Noticing the safety pin. Noticing the canvas bag instead of a leather purse. Noticing that she didn't quite belong. One woman, younger, maybe 40, with perfectly highlighted hair, smiled briefly. A polite smile. The kind you give to someone you feel a little sorry for. Margaret found a folding chair in the corner and sat down, smoothing her dress over her knees. The tear pulled slightly, and she adjusted the safety pin, her cheeks burning. Why had she come? What made her think she could stand up there and sing in front of these people, these confident, comfortable people who probably never had to choose between fixing a dress and buying groceries? The auditions began. One by one, the women were called up. They sang beautifully, most of them, trained voices, clear and precise. The kind of singing you hear on recordings, polished and perfect. Susan nodded after each one, made notes on her clipboard, smiled encouragingly. The church basement filled with applause, the gentle, supportive kind. Everything was so proper, so refined. Margaret's turn came closer. Her heart hammered against her ribs. She pressed her hand against her chest, trying to calm it. What song would she even sing? She prepared Ave Maria, the version her mother used to sing to her when she was small. But now, listening to all these accomplished voices, it seemed foolish, presumptuous. Who was she to sing Ave Maria? Margaret Chun? Susan's voice carried across the basement, kind, expectant. Margaret stood. Her knees felt weak. She picked up her canvas bag and walked to the front, each step echoing too loudly in her own ears. She could feel them watching her, could feel them taking in the torn dress, the gray hair she tried to pin back neatly, but which had already started to come loose. She reached the front and turned to face them, all those faces, and suddenly her throat closed up completely. What will you be singing for us today, Margaret? Susan asked gently. Margaret opened her mouth. Nothing came out. She tried again, managed to whisper, Ave Maria. A few of the women exchanged glances. Ave Maria. Of course. One of the most challenging pieces in the classical repertoire. And this little woman in the torn dress thought she could manage it? Susan nodded encouragingly. Whenever you're ready, dear. Margaret closed her eyes. Her hands were shaking so badly she had to clasp them together. She thought about leaving, just turning around and walking out, saving herself the humiliation. But then something else rose up in her, something fierce and old, a memory of her mother's voice. You have a gift, Mei Ling. A gift is not yours to keep locked away. It belongs to the world. even if the world doesn't know it needs it. She took a breath, a deep one, down into her belly, the way she'd been taught all those years ago, and she began to sing. The first note came out soft, trembling, uncertain, but the second note was stronger, and by the third note, something was happening. Something was opening up inside her, like a door she kept locked for 30 years was finally swinging wide. Her voice filled the basement, not the polished, perfect sound of the other women. This was something else entirely. This was raw and real and absolutely pure. This was pain and joy and longing and hope all woven together. This was every late night she'd spent crying for her lost husband. Every morning she'd woken up aching and exhausted. Every moment she'd felt small and invisible and forgotten. All of it poured out of her in that ancient, sacred melody. The room went absolutely still. Margaret's eyes were still closed. She was back in Hong Kong, young again, singing in the small theater while her mother watched from the front row with tears streaming down her face. She was holding her husband's hand in the hospital, singing softly to him as he slipped away. She was alone in her tiny apartment, singing to herself because it was the only thing that made the loneliness bearable. She was all of these Margarets at once, and they were all singing together every version of herself she'd ever been, every dream she'd buried, every hope she'd tried to forget. The last note hung in the air, shimmering, perfect. Then silence. Complete, absolute silence. Margaret opened her eyes. Every single person in that basement was staring at her. Some of the women had their hands pressed over their mouths. Others had tears running down their cheeks. Susan, the choir director, was openly crying, not even trying to hide it. The woman with the highlighted hair who'd given Margaret that pitying smile earlier was sobbing quietly into her hands. Margaret didn't understand. Had she done something wrong? Had she embarrassed herself? She started to apologize, her voice small again. "I'm sorry, I know I'm not." "Stop." Susan stood up, walked toward her. "Don't you dare apologize. Don't you dare." She reached Margaret and took both her hands. That was Margaret. That was... I don't even have words. In 20 years of directing choirs, I have never heard anything like that. The other women began to applaud. Not the polite, gentle applause from before. This was real, urgent, heartfelt. They stood up, all of them, and the applause grew louder. Some of them were still crying. One elderly woman, who'd auditioned earlier with a lovely soprano, came forward and hugged Margaret tightly, whispering, "Thank you. Thank you for reminding me why we sing." Margaret stood there, overwhelmed, as these women, these strangers, surrounded her with warmth and acceptance she never expected. The woman with the highlighted hair approached, her makeup smudged from tears. "I'm sorry," she said quietly. "I'm so sorry for judging you when you walked in. I saw your dress and I thought, God, I'm so ashamed of myself. You have a gift, a real gift." Susan was still holding Margaret's hands. "Will you join us? Please? I know you probably work, and I know auditions aren't supposed to work this way, but Margaret, you belong in this choir. You belong at the center of this choir. Will you join us?" Margaret looked at all these faces, no longer seeing the expensive clothes or the perfect hair. She saw women, just women, women who'd been moved by something real, women who understood, in that moment, what it meant to be vulnerable and brave at the same time. "Yes," she whispered. "Yes, I like that very much." The Christmas concert 3 weeks later was held in the main sanctuary, packed with people. The choir performed beautifully, every number polished and practiced. But when Margaret stepped forward for her solo, when she opened her mouth and that pure, honest, heartbreaking voice filled the church, something shifted in the room. You could feel it, tangible as a touch. People who'd come out of obligation, who'd been checking their phones or thinking about dinner plans, suddenly stopped. They stopped and they listened, really listened. An elderly man in the third row began to cry, thinking of his wife who'd passed that spring. A teenage girl, dragged there by her parents, felt something crack open in her chest, some hardness she'd been carrying. A young mother, exhausted and overwhelmed, felt her shoulders relax for the first time in months. All because of this small woman in a simple dress, better than the torn one, but still nothing fancy, singing her heart out like it was the last thing she'd ever do. After the concert, people lined up to speak to Margaret, to thank her, to tell her what her voice had meant to them. She stood there, humble and a little bewildered, accepting their gratitude with quiet grace. The woman with the highlighted hair, whose name was Jennifer, approached with her husband. "Margaret," she said, "my company is looking for someone to sing at our annual charity gala in the spring. I know it's not much, but there's an honorarium, $500 for one song. Would you consider it?" Margaret's eyes widened. $500 for one song? That was almost a week's worth of cleaning houses. She stammered. "I don't know if I'm—" "You are," Jennifer said firmly. "You absolutely are. And honestly, we should be paying you more." Over the following months, word spread. Margaret was invited to sing at a wedding, then a funeral, where her rendition of Amazing Grace left not a single dry eye. Then another church concert. Then a small recording studio asked if she'd be willing to record some hymns for an album of local artists. The money wasn't life-changing, but it was something. More than something. It was validation. It was proof that her gift, the gift her mother had told her about so many years ago, still mattered. But more than the money, more than the opportunities, something else had changed. Margaret walked differently now. She held her head a little higher, not with pride, exactly, with recognition. Recognition that she was valuable, that she had something to offer, that her years of struggle and sacrifice and silence hadn't erased the essential truth of who she was. She still cleaned houses. She still wore simple dresses and carried her canvas bag. But now when she cleaned, she sang. Softly at first, then louder. And her clients, instead of asking her to be quiet, would stop what they were doing and listen. One woman told her that hearing Margaret sing while she worked was the best part of her week. Susan, the choir director, became a dear friend. They'd have coffee after rehearsals, and one evening Susan asked her, "Margaret, that day you auditioned, what made you come? After all those years of not singing, what made you finally walk through that door?" Margaret thought about it, stirring her coffee slowly. "I was tired," she said finally, "tired of being invisible. Tired of pretending that the biggest part of me didn't exist. I thought, I'm 67 years old. How much time do I have left to be afraid? And I realized I can't afford fear anymore. None of us can. We can't afford to hide our light, especially if we think it's not bright enough or good enough or worthy enough. Because it is. It always is." Susan nodded, her eyes glistening. "Thank you for being brave enough to show us that." 2 years later, Margaretchen stood on the stage of a much larger church for a regional choir festival. She was 69 now, her hair more gray, her hands still rough from work. But when she sang, when that voice poured out of her, it didn't matter what she looked like or where she came from or how torn her dress had been that first day. What mattered was the gift she'd almost buried forever, the gift that had saved her, and in saving her had touched countless others. Because that's what real beauty does. It doesn't perform. It doesn't pretend. It simply tells the truth in whatever voice it has, with whatever it has been given. And somehow, impossibly, miraculously, that truth is always enough. It's always more than enough. It's everything.